You're not dreaming. You really are in Victorian England. And unfortunately, you're respectable, which means you're about to suffer through the worst ordeal any decent Victorian could endure, keeping up appearances while your private life quietly unravels just a few feet behind a locked door. Close your eyes. Sink back into a room of heavy curtains, smoky lamps, and carpets so thick they swallow sound. You're inside a Victorian bedroom now, but don't get too comfortable. This is where reputations cracked, marriages collapsed, and secrets slipped into the firelight. On the surface, the bed is neatly made, the wallpaper looks proper, and the perfume is cloying enough to pass for refinement. But here's the truth. Behind these bedroom doors is where the real history of the age played out. Not in Parliament, not in drawing rooms. Here, between the sheets, under the curtains, scribbled in secret letters, and whispered through tears. Before we begin, make sure you've subscribed, and tell me in the comments what country you're watching from tonight. For the next few hours, you'll wander through those closed doors. You'll find scandal, longing, betrayal, and the sort of respectable hypocrisy only Victorians could turn into an art form. By day, you are the very picture of propriety. Your gloves are spotless, your smile fixed, and your posture straighter than the oak beams holding up the drawing room ceiling. You say, "Good afternoon," with the right inflection, curtsy or bow without wobbling, and never let a single eyebrow twitch betray how bored you are by Mr. So-and-so's endless story about railway shares. But all that performance has a shelf life, and the shelf is surprisingly short. The second the parlor doors shut and you retreat upstairs, your polished manners peel away faster than the wallpaper in a damp London townhouse. Behind that thick bedroom door, where only the faint crackle of the coal fire and the occasional cough of a servant bear witness, the truth comes tumbling out. This is the unspoken contract of Victorian life. Outside the bedroom, you were a monument to respectability. Inside, you were just a flawed, tired, and occasionally furious human being. Victorian society was obsessed with appearances. Neighbors didn't just watch, they studied. They noticed who left their blinds open, who ordered fresh flowers every week, who replaced their front steps with white marble, and who let the soot settle. Reputation was a kind of currency, and it was audited daily. So in public, you smiled. You attended church. You said the right things about the Queen. You kept your children looking angelic, your spouse looking dutiful, and your voice just the right pitch of polite. Even inside your own house, in rooms where visitors might be received, the charade continued. The parlor was a stage, the dining room a theater, but the bedroom? That was the dressing room backstage. There, respectability cracked, sometimes quietly, sometimes with the slam of a door loud enough to rattle the servants' quarters. It's easy to think of Victorians as permanently stiff and buttoned up, frozen in sepia photographs with pinched expressions. But the truth is, they argued as passionately as anyone. The difference is, they did it where no one respectable could hear. Bedrooms were arenas for whispered fights, accusations about money, suspicions about infidelity, resentments about in-laws. Picture it. The respectable wife, corset unlaced, sitting rigidly at the edge of the bed, voice sharp but quiet. You promised you'd be home at 10, not midnight, and you reek of port. The respectable husband, boots barely off, muttering back, "Better port than your endless tears." Both desperate to keep the volume low, because the walls were thin and servants had ears like hawks. Even the creak of a floorboard in the corridor could give away just how harmonious a marriage really was. And if it wasn't arguments, it was tears. Bedrooms held the griefs that polite society refused to acknowledge. Women mourning miscarriages they couldn't admit aloud. Men despairing over debts they couldn't confess. Children weeping into pillows after being told to sit silently during yet another 3-hour dinner. Respectability demanded that all this emotion be hidden. The parlor tolerated small talk. The church pew demanded stoicism, but the bedroom was soaked in tears. Some diaries of the period read like emotional floodgates unleashed at midnight. Words scratched in candlelight because there was no one else safe to confide in. And those diaries were almost always hidden away, buried under gowns or tucked inside writing desks. To let them be found was to risk scandal, proof that your life wasn't as tidy as your posture suggested. Now we can joke about parliament debates being dull, and they were, but at least those arguments were written down. The arguments behind bedroom doors never made the record. These were the real politics of Victorian life. Who controlled the household money? Who decided which child went to school? Who locked whose bedroom door at night? These negotiations weren't listed in the Times or reported by gentlemen in wigs. They were whispered at 1 a.m, half drowned out by the hiss of a coal fire. They determined futures just as much as laws did, but without the dignity of parchment. It wasn't all shouting and crying. Bedrooms also gave Victorians rare moments of relief. A woman might finally peel off the armor of her corset, sighing like a prisoner freed. A man might loosen his cravat and admit, if only to the silence, that he couldn't keep up with the facade another day. For some, it was the only space where laughter dared creep in. Not polite laughter, not the kind offered at the dinner table, but the unrestrained kind. A joke muttered in bed, a ridiculous moment with hair half undone, a brief collapse of dignity that could never survive in the parlor. Respectability was heavy. The bedroom was where it occasionally slipped off the shoulders. Of course, bedrooms were never fully private. Servants came and went, pretending to be deaf to the arguments or blind to the tears. But they noticed. They always noticed. They knew which doors slammed most often, which mistress wept into her pillows nightly, which master stumbled upstairs smelling of cigar smoke and guilt. They carried chamber pots out in the morning, but they also carried stories that floated through kitchens and sculleries, reshaping reputations from below stairs upward. So even the bedroom's privacy was partial, like a cracked mask rather than a removed one. It's tempting to laugh at the Victorians for their stiff upper lips, their refusal to admit human messiness in daylight. But think of the cost. Every smile was measured, every handshake rehearsed, every interaction coded. By night, when the mask came off, what was left wasn't freedom, it was exhaustion. Respectability wasn't a shield. It was a performance, and like all performances, it left the actors drained. The bedroom was where they collapsed, sometimes in tears, sometimes in anger, sometimes in silence so profound it said more than words ever could. Now imagine yourself as one of them. By day you parade through London streets, nodding politely at neighbors, checking your reflection in every shop window to make sure your hat sits just so. By night, you're here. In a room heavy with velvet curtains, the fire sputtering low, the door latched firmly shut. You sit on the edge of the bed, staring at the wallpaper, wondering if you can endure another day of pretending. Outside, your neighbors think you're flawless. Inside, you feel like you're falling apart, and the only witnesses to your collapse are the coal fire, the heavy quilt, and the diary you hide beneath your pillow. Respectability ended the moment the bedroom door clicked shut. Out there, you were a monument to virtue. In here, you were just human. And the truth, messy, scandalous, heartbroken, or quietly rebellious, lived here, not in Parliament, not in newspapers, not even in the parlor. It lived behind bedroom doors. Marriage, they said, was the cornerstone of Victorian society, respectable, holy, and unbreakable. The vows were ironclad, the portraits painted in oil, the family names joined in legal contracts. But if you tiptoe down the hallways of a respectable London townhouse at night and press your ear against the right door, you'll discover a truth more awkward than sacred. Inside, two people lie rigidly in bed, their backs turned to one another, the silence heavier than the coal smoke hanging in the curtains. The marriage looks unshakable in daylight, but here in the bedroom, it is little more than a treaty under constant strain. You could almost hear the silence groaning. Victorians had a peculiar way of treating intimacy, not as affection, not even as pleasure, but as a duty, a performance. The husband entered the bedroom not with longing but with obligation, ticking off boxes in his mental ledger. The wife lay still, corset loosened but composure never quite discarded, bracing herself for another round of marital harmony. And when the duty was done, silence again. Each rolled back to their own side, staring at the ceiling or the embroidered edge of the pillowcase, wondering if this was what eternity would feel like. It was. For many Victorian men, the bedroom wasn't the place to spend an evening at all. Clubs, taverns, political dinners, those were far more appealing. So the husband slipped home at midnight, boots clattering softly on the stairs, shirt reeking of smoke and port. The wife had been waiting in vain for hours, a candle stub burning low, the sound of every carriage on the street making her heart jump. But no apology was ever offered and none was ever demanded. Respectable couples didn't discuss such humiliations. They simply let the silence grow thicker. That silence became its own weapon. Some couples perfected it like an art. Entire arguments were fought without a single word, conducted in frosty glances across the breakfast table, in bed sheets folded too crisply, in doors shut just a little too firmly. Victorian marriage wasn't always loud. More often, it was a duel of absence, where withholding affection hurt far more than raising one's voice. And sometimes, the silence wasn't just an argument. It was an arrangement. Among the upper and middle classes, separate bedrooms became fashionable. Officially, they were for health. Doctors claimed that sharing a bed meant sharing germs, or worse, sharing breath. Night air was believed to sap vitality, and lying too close to another human was practically suicidal. At least that's what the medical journals claimed. The real truth? Many couples found separate bedrooms a convenient excuse for permanent distance. The architecture of respectable houses even began to reflect this quiet separation. His bedroom, solid, dark, with leather-bound books and the smell of tobacco. Hers, delicate, perfumed, littered with lace and embroidery. A bell cord linked the two rooms, a silent rope that could be pulled for contact. It looked like health-conscious living, but it was really the blueprint of emotional exile. You might imagine that such arrangements gave Victorians more freedom, but no, the duty remained. A husband might make a formal visit to his wife's bedroom, like a guest stepping into a parlor. The act of intimacy was treated with the same politeness as a business call. And when it was over, he might slip back to his own room, leaving her staring at the embroidered ceiling, wondering if this was love or simply a contractual obligation. For many wives, the only place they confess their true feelings wasn't to their husbands at all. It was in diaries, tiny books bound in leather, pages inked by candlelight. Some entries read like battlefield dispatches, reports of lonely nights, of waiting by doors that never opened, of hearts quietly breaking while the rest of the world praised the perfect household. These diaries were rarely discovered because their owners hid them like contraband. To leave them in the open was to risk scandal, proof that beneath the polished surface, the marriage was a wasteland. And yet, you mustn't think these silent wars were always one-sided. Husbands, too, sometimes scribbled confessions, though in different tones. Regret about debts, shame over mistresses, even dread about stepping back into that silent bedroom where their wives' eyes told them more than words ever could. If the parlors of Victorian homes were stages for polite performances, the bedrooms were battlefields where no one dared raise a voice. Now picture yourself there. You're lying in a four-poster bed, the curtains drawn heavy around you. The fire has burned down to embers. You can hear your spouse's steady breathing, but you feel no comfort in it, only distance. Your hands are folded neatly on the coverlet, as though you were posing for a death mask. The silence is unbearable, but you don't break it. You wouldn't dare. To speak would risk opening the floodgates, and respectability cannot survive floods. Downstairs, the servants know exactly what's going on. They notice whose boots arrive late, whose side of the bed is untouched, who orders a hot water bottle for their headache night after night. Gossip thrives on such details. Respectability may keep couples silent, but it never fooled the servants. The wars of marriage were fought upstairs, but the stories of those battles trickled downward into kitchens, sculleries, and coal cellars. The most tragic part of it all? This wasn't considered unusual. This was considered normal. The stiff silence of Victorian bedrooms was praised as discipline, proof of restraint, evidence of a higher moral standard. No one admitted that it was loneliness masquerading as virtue. Imagine, night after night, playing out this ritual. The silence, the distance, the heavy curtains drawn shut. The bed becomes a stage, but the play never changes. No audience applauds, no critic reviews. Just the two of you, trapped in a performance of marriage where intimacy is duty and silence is applause. And when dawn breaks, the curtain rises again. You both step out of that suffocating silence, dress in proper attire, and descend to the breakfast table as though nothing at all has happened. Respectability requires the performance to continue, after all. And the wars of the night remain locked behind doors that no one dares to open. Respectable Victorians loved to pretend their bedrooms were sanctuaries of virtue. The heavy curtains, the four-poster beds, the embroidered coverlets, all symbols of moral order and self-control. But if you stay quiet in the corridors after dark, if you wait long enough to hear the bells ring softly in the distance, you'll discover those bedrooms were less about affection and far more about betrayal. The respectable husband, for instance. By day, he looked the part. Tall hat, firm handshake, fatherly smile. He spoke with gravitas about trade, politics, or the importance of moral discipline. But wait until midnight. Then you'll hear his boots creak on the stairs as he sneaks down one hallway and up another. The servants, of course, notice. They always notice. And if you were in that household, you'd notice too. The quiet click of a lock, the rustle of skirts, and the muffled laughter coming from a door that was supposed to stay firmly shut. Bells were often strung between rooms, little cords that tugged a servant from the attic or the basement to attend a need. But the bells weren't always rung for water or firewood. Sometimes they were rung with a discreet twitch, summoning a maid at midnight with a letter that had to be delivered at once, or signaling that the mistress of the house required her husband's presence. Though curiously, he was already at someone else's bedside. Bells, in other words, were instruments of intrigue. And then there were the trysts that didn't even bother with secrecy. Husbands sometimes brought mistresses under the same roof, lodging them as companions or governesses. A few even installed lovers in nearby houses, slipping away under the pretense of business. The wives, outwardly composed, often knew exactly what was happening. But propriety demanded silence. To protest was to create a scandal. And in Victorian society, silence was less humiliating than honesty. Of course, scandals had a way of surfacing anyway. Servants found out first. They discovered rumpled sheets in the wrong room, stockings discarded under the wrong bed, or lingering perfumes that didn't match the mistress's bottle. Gossip was currency downstairs, and one whiff of intrigue could pay the rent in entertainment for weeks. Once a servant whispered, the story spread like smoke, and the higher the household stood in society, the greater the amusement. Children, too, sometimes stumbled into truths they weren't meant to see. A child waking in the night to fetch water might wander into the wrong corridor, push open a door, and glimpse a figure where no figure should be. Some children remembered those moments for years, little fragments of memory never written down, but never forgotten either. Bedrooms became classrooms of hypocrisy, teaching lessons children weren't supposed to learn. And then there were the infamous affairs that spilled beyond the household. The Victorians were masters at public virtue and private chaos, and when trysts leaked into the newspapers, it was almost always catastrophic. A respectable gentleman caught at a hotel with someone else's wife. A duchess spotted at an inn, her carriage left outside in unmistakable style. The more respectable the name, the juicier the whispers. If you were living then, you'd have heard the rumors ripple through drawing rooms, disguised as moral concern, but delivered with relish. How dreadful, how shameful, they'd murmur, while leaning in just a little closer to savor every detail. Respectability required condemnation, but human curiosity required tea. For the participants, though, it wasn't tea, it was survival. Many wives turned to lovers because their husbands abandoned them emotionally or physically, retreating to clubs or brothels instead of beds. Many husbands turned to mistresses because their marriages were never built on affection, only contracts. The tryst was not always about passion. Sometimes it was about feeling alive for a few minutes in a world obsessed with control. Imagine yourself there. You're sitting in your own bedroom, candle flickering. The house hushed around you. You hear footsteps, not toward your door, but past it. You know exactly where they're going. Your heart races, but you say nothing. Tomorrow, you will smile at breakfast as though nothing happened. Respectability requires the silence, but the crack in your chest is real, and it will widen with every passing night. Or perhaps you're the one sneaking. Boots in hand, breath held, you slip along the corridor with the skill of a burglar. You knock gently at the door of someone who isn't your spouse. The door opens just enough for you to slide inside, and in that moment, the rules of society evaporate. For an hour or two, you are free, until the morning when the performance resumes. The servants hear. The neighbors suspect. The children wonder. But nothing is ever spoken aloud. That is the Victorian way. Sin performed in silence, respectability maintained with gritted teeth. And yet, the irony is this. Those very betrayals gave the age its most delicious stories. Diaries filled with hints of forbidden love. Court transcripts recording scandals with embarrassed detail. Letters burned in fireplaces, leaving only ash as evidence of passion. Bedrooms were not just sites of sleep or duty. They were theaters of betrayal, stages where desire and deceit played the leading roles. By daylight, the bed was neatly made, curtains drawn back, carpets brushed spotless. But by night, it became a battlefield of secrets. Husbands and wives fought wars of absence, of infidelity, of unspoken resentments. Lovers crossed thresholds that should have remained locked. And the house itself seemed complicit. Every bell cord and corridor conspiring to carry secrets from one door to another. Respectable Victorians liked to say their homes were castles. In reality, their bedrooms were cages, filled with whispered betrayals that echoed long after the candles went out. And if you don't subscribe, those voices stay forgotten, their secrets buried again in silence. If you really want to know what happened behind Victorian bedroom doors, don't bother asking the lords and ladies who slept there. Ask the people who polished the brass, carried the coal, and scrubbed the sheets. Servants noticed everything. And they noticed it whether you wanted them to or not. You could slam a door in fury, whisper in the dark, or sneak down a corridor at midnight. But by sunrise, the maids would know whose bed had been left untouched. The sheets spoke louder than any diary entry. Creases unbroken, pillows unrumpled, the blanket still tucked tightly into the corners. A wife might smile sweetly at breakfast, but the maid who collected her linens already knew the truth. Her husband had never come to bed. Valets kept their own quiet tally, too. They were the ones waiting when the master stumbled home in the small hours, boots scuffed and smelling of cigars. A valet didn't need to ask where he'd been. The stains on the collar, the perfume clinging to the coat, and the late return time scribbled their own confession. And none of this stayed confined to the bedrooms. Servants had their own gossip network, faster than any telegraph, sharper than any newspaper. In the kitchens, in the sculleries, over the endless hours of mending and cleaning, stories flowed. Whose mistress wept into her pillow, whose master hadn't crossed the threshold of his wife's room in months, which guest slipped into which chamber after the household had gone to bed. The servants' world thrived on these fragments. To them, upstairs, respectability was a comedy, and the punchlines were written in sheets and boots. The irony was that reputations rose and fell on the words of those who weren't even supposed to exist. The best servants are invisible, Victorians like to say, and yet invisibility gave them more power than their masters ever guessed. A careless word, a knowing glance, a raised eyebrow, these could spread suspicion faster than ink. If a footman hinted that his master was very late again last night, the gossip would ripple through the servants' hall and eventually leak into the outside world. Respectability balanced on the silence of those who had the least reason to protect it. Imagine yourself as one of them. You're a maid, rising before dawn, creeping softly through corridors with a candle stub to check on the rooms. You tug open the curtains, shake out the sheets, and see it. One side of the bed untouched, the other crumpled with restless sleep. You don't need a novel to tell you what happened here. The story is pressed into the linen itself. By the time you reach the laundry, the words are already spilling out. he never came to bed. Or picture yourself as a valet. You wait in silence, lamp in hand, until the master finally returns. His steps are uneven, his cheeks flushed with drink. He hands you his coat, and you smell the perfume instantly. Something floral, not the wife's usual rosewater. You hang the coat carefully, as though the scent might fall off if you're not gentle. But in your mind, you're already rehearsing how you'll describe this to the other servants tomorrow. Not explicitly, of course, just a sly remark, enough to make them laugh. Servants were the quiet witnesses to hypocrisy, but they also carried its weight. They were forced to tidy up the aftermath, the spilled wine, the shredded letters, the makeup stains that weren't the mistress's shade. They fetched hot water bottles for headaches that were really hangovers, brewed teas to calm nerves frayed by betrayal, and changed bedding that told stories no one dared write down. Every act of service was a brush with someone else's secret, and secrets inevitably slipped out, sometimes deliberately. A disgruntled maid dismissed without reference might take revenge by spreading tales. Sometimes accidentally. A careless whisper overheard in the market, a slip of the tongue in front of another household's butler. Whole reputations could collapse under the weight of one servant's story. Victorians prided themselves on building households that ran like clockwork, where the hierarchy was strict and unbending. But the truth was, the entire facade depended on the loyalty of the lowest rungs. The power was upside down. A lady might hold the keys to the silver cabinet, but her maid held the keys to her reputation. Servants didn't need to invent gossip. They only had to describe what they saw. A pair of boots left outside the wrong door. A candlestick with wax dripped too low for a single evening. 2 glasses left in a room where there should have been one. Respectability was undone by details. And sometimes, the gossip traveled beyond the household. Servants moved frequently, from one position to another, from one town to the next. Each carried stories with them, like a second trunk of luggage. What began as a whisper in a kitchen could end as a rumor in a drawing room miles away. The higher the rank of the master, the greater the amusement when the story surfaced. Now imagine yourself as the master or mistress. You slam your bedroom door shut, certain that no one heard. But downstairs, the staff are already trading looks. You scribble a letter by candlelight, certain it will stay hidden. But it's the maid who delivers it. You think your secrets are locked tight behind oak doors. In reality, they are folded into laundry baskets, carried on trays, and tucked into servants' memories. Respectability in Victorian England wasn't destroyed by public scandal most of the time. It was eroded, piece by piece, by the quiet observations of those who polished the mirrors and scrubbed the floors. Your castle could be built of stone, but if the servants started talking, its walls were made of paper. If there was ever a profession designed to make everyone uncomfortable, it was the governess. Educated enough to raise children properly, polite enough to dine at the family table, and often young enough to be noticed in ways that made mistresses frown and masters linger. The governess lived perpetually on the threshold of respectability, close enough to breathe it in, but never far from being suffocated by it. You can imagine the scene. A grand Victorian home, children tucked into tidy nurseries, and in the room next door, a governess in her modest quarters. Her furnishings are simple: a narrow bed, a writing desk with a flickering candle, perhaps a shelf of battered books. She's not quite family, not quite servant, and absolutely not welcome in either world. She is, in the cruel language of the age, a danger by proximity. Mistresses of the house knew it. They watched the governess with wary eyes, noting every detail. The way she smoothed her gown before stepping into the drawing room. The way she answered questions with too much intelligence. The way her youth clashed painfully with their own aging reflection in the mirror. If the husband lingered too long in the nursery, or if the governess's voice carried just a little too brightly through the corridor, suspicion stirred like coal smoke in a closed room. And masters, well, not all, but enough. They often treated the governess as if she were invisible, until she wasn't. A kind word here, a prolonged glance there, a book recommended and delivered directly to her desk. Nothing happened, of course. Nothing respectable could. But in households where reputations were already fragile, the possibility of scandal was enough to ignite the whole structure. Bedrooms made the situation worse. Governesses were typically placed near the children, which meant near enough to the family's private wing to make mistresses nervous. The corridors were thin, the walls thinner. A midnight cry from the nursery, and suddenly the governess was in her dressing gown, steps away from the marital chambers. Too close for comfort, too close for propriety. Now imagine being her. You're seated at your little desk, scratching out a letter home. You can hear the muffled laughter of the family downstairs, a laughter you will never share in. You're not a guest. You're not a servant. You are tolerated, but not embraced. And every sound that drifts through your thin walls reminds you how precarious your position is. One whisper of impropriety, one accusation, true or not, and you're finished. No reference, no employment, no second chance. Whispers, in fact, were the governess's worst enemy. They required no proof. A servant might mutter that the master looked too kindly on her. A child might repeat something overheard without understanding its meaning. A mistress might convince herself of an affair because it was easier than facing her husband's indifference. The mere suggestion was enough to ruin a career. Governesses fell not through action, but through rumor. The diaries of the time are full of their voices. Entries describing crushing loneliness, the gnawing awareness that they lived among people but were never truly of them. Some wrote about hunger, not for food, but for conversation, for respect, for friendship. Others wrote of fear, the fear of dismissal, of disgrace, of being cast adrift in a world where single, jobless women had few options beyond poverty or worse. Mistresses, of course, had their own fears. They feared their governesses because they understood exactly how fragile reputation could be. They had seen other households collapse into gossip because of a single insinuation. They had watched friends shunned from drawing rooms because their governess got too close. So they guarded their bedrooms like fortresses, ensuring doors were locked, visits curtailed, and the governess kept firmly on her side of the social moat. But the irony? The governess was rarely guilty of the sins she was accused of. More often than not, she was exhausted, underpaid, and desperate to avoid notice at all. The supposed temptress of gossip was, in reality, a lonely figure eating supper alone in her small room while the family dined together downstairs. She was, as one contemporary writer put it, too much a lady to be a servant, too much a servant to be a lady. And yet, her presence near the bedrooms carried constant tension. Respectable families needed governesses. No one else could teach their children French verbs or the finer points of piano. But they resented needing her, resented her youth, resented her intelligence, resented her very existence. She was a symbol of inadequacy for mistresses and a temptation, imagined or real, for masters. Now put yourself in the mistress's shoes. You hear the governess's footsteps in the corridor, light and quick. You tell yourself it means nothing, but at night, as you lie in your own bed, you wonder, what if? The fear is irrational, perhaps, but in Victorian society, reputation didn't need facts. It only needed whispers. Or imagine you're the governess herself. A sudden knock at your door late in the evening. You freeze, pen in hand, because you know a knock could mean ruin. If it's the mistress, perhaps a command. If it's the master, perhaps worse. You wait, breath held, until the sound fades away. And in the morning, you smile politely at the children as though nothing happened. This was the governess problem. She was necessary, but never safe. Necessary to teach, to raise, to refine the next generation. Unsafe because her very presence near the private wing of the house invited suspicion. One day she might be praised as indispensable. The next, she might be sent packing with her character in tatters. The bedrooms of Victorian homes were not only stages for marital silence or betrayal, they were also the shadowy backdrop of these invisible dramas. The governess, always hovering nearby, became a figure of both fear and pity. She represented what every Victorian dreaded: being trapped in a world where your worth depended not on your actions, but on what others chose to whisper about you. By daylight, the Victorian bedroom was a chamber of order. Bed neatly made, curtains tied back, a prayer book or Bible displayed prominently on the bedside table. But the moment the door shut, the curtains drawn, and the candle lit, the same room transformed into something far riskier. It became a private library of contraband and a post office of secrets. Victorians adored rules, and they adored breaking them even more. Nowhere was that more obvious than in the pages hidden under their mattresses and the letters tucked into secret drawers. Officially, respectable people read sermons, Dickens, and improving literature. Unofficially, they smuggled in French novels so scandalous they made even Paris blush. Balzac, Zola, Dumas, sometimes wrapped in plain brown covers to pass as something moral, sometimes slipped inside the covers of an entirely different book, so that to the casual glance, you were dutifully reading sermons when in fact you were knee-deep in forbidden affairs and torrid escapades. The bedroom was the only safe place to read such things. You couldn't risk the parlor. Too many visitors. You couldn't risk the dining room. Too many eyes. But behind a closed door, by the flicker of candlelight, you could sit in your dressing gown and devour words no one admitted they craved. The thrill wasn't only in the stories themselves, but in the danger. If someone opened the door too quickly, the shame could be enough to sink a family's reputation. And then there were the letters. Letters were the lifeblood of Victorian secrets. The post was fast, cheap, and constant, which meant affairs, betrayals, confessions, and dreams could all be committed to ink. But letters were also deadly. To write was to risk, and the bedroom was the only place you dared do it. Imagine yourself there, sitting at a little writing desk, candle guttering low, quill scratching furiously as you pour onto paper what you could never say aloud. A declaration of longing, a plea for forgiveness, a detail of debt or shame that had to be hidden at all costs. Men hid their letters about gambling losses, unpaid loans, or political double dealings. Women hid their love notes, written in trembling hands, each word a quiet rebellion against the silence their lives demanded. Both tucked them away with desperate care, behind mirrors, inside hollow dictionaries, even under loose floorboards. Bedrooms filled with ingenious hiding places, writing desks with secret drawers, wardrobes with false backs, even the linings of pillows carefully slit open and resewn. Furniture makers were sometimes complicit, building private compartments that no one admitted existed. To the family, it was just a desk. To the mistress or master, it was a vault of dangerous truth. But no hiding place was safe enough. Servants stumbled upon them while dusting. Children tugged open drawers they weren't meant to. A spouse, suspicious and determined, rifled through the desk until they found the incriminating scrap of paper. The discovery of a single letter could destroy everything. There are stories of respectable households torn apart by a page or two of ink, a note declaring forbidden love, a receipt proving ruinous debt, a letter exposing betrayal. Court cases of the time are full of such evidence. Letters produced like weapons, waved aloft to prove adultery or deception. What had once been whispered in candlelight was suddenly read aloud in a courtroom. Imagine hearing your own words, meant for one set of eyes only, now spoken in public to rows of scandal-hungry faces. No wonder so many Victorians fed their secrets to the fire instead. Ah yes, the fireplace, the last line of defense. Bedrooms across Britain flickered not just with warming flames, but with the destruction of evidence. Letters tossed into the grate, curling black, words devoured by fire before morning. Lovers' words turned to ash, debts reduced to smoke. The trouble was, fireplaces betrayed you too. A servant might smell the distinct tang of burning paper. A spouse might notice the pile of ash unusually high. Even destruction carried risk. Picture yourself in that moment. You've written a letter you should never have dared put to paper. The words feel heavier than the pen itself. You hear footsteps in the corridor, panic, and shove the page into a drawer. Or perhaps you crumple it in shaking hands and thrust it into the fire, watching as the flame licks away your confession. The room fills with smoke, but you feel no relief. You've silenced the words, for now, but you know how fragile the secret remains. The truth is, Victorian bedrooms were never really quiet. They buzzed with words, written, hidden, burned. Respectability demanded silence, but human hearts demanded expression. And so the bedroom became the battlefield between the two. Every forbidden novel read under a blanket, every trembling letter written by candlelight, every drawer with a secret compartment was a skirmish in that war. In Parliament, the debates rumbled on about empire, railways, and reform. In the drawing rooms, small talk and tea. But in bedrooms, history was written in ink, sealed in envelopes, hidden in furniture, and destroyed in fire. Respectable Victorians lived double lives, and the evidence of those lives wasn't etched on their faces. It was tucked into their letters. And if you want to find the real story, the betrayals, the debts, the passions that never made it to the official record, you don't look at the portraits or the newspapers. You look under the pillow. You open the drawer that sticks. You sift through the ashes in the fireplace. That's where the Victorians kept their truths. Respectable Victorians didn't talk about addiction. Addiction was something that happened to sailors in dockside taverns, or to wastrels stumbling out of gin palaces, or to the unfortunate souls huddled in London's slums. But behind bedroom doors, that was another matter. In those quiet, velvet-draped rooms, dependence wasn't only common, it was practically encouraged. Take laudanum, a polite amber-colored tincture of opium, dissolved in alcohol, sold in neat glass bottles with respectable labels. It was advertised in newspapers, prescribed by doctors, and stocked in almost every household. A few drops for a headache, a spoonful for nerves, a stronger dose for sleeplessness. Laudanum was so ordinary it didn't even raise eyebrows. And yet, night after night, it pulled thousands of Victorians into chemical sleep instead of each other's arms. Picture the scene. You're sitting at your bedside table, candlelight flickering, the day's polite performances finally over. The house is quiet, the children asleep, your spouse snoring faintly across the room, or perhaps in another room entirely. You open a small bottle, pour a measure into a glass, and drink. The warmth spreads, your eyelids grow heavy, and the silence of the bedroom thickens. You call it medicine. Everyone does. But it's the same opium that filled London's opium dens, only dressed up in better glassware. And laudanum wasn't alone. Tonics, powders, cordials, an entire apothecary of dependence was disguised as respectable medicine. Women bought soothing syrups for their nerves, not realizing the syrup was laced with morphine. Men bought stimulants to ward off fatigue, only to find themselves hooked on cocaine. Even children were dosed, their restless cries silenced by a spoonful of syrup that promised peace and delivered sedation. Bedrooms were not only places of whispered secrets, but places of slow, nightly intoxication. The curious thing was how carefully these addictions were hidden. Wives often measured their doses discreetly, waiting until their husbands had left the room. Husbands swallowed powders quickly before their wives returned from prayers. Children knew nothing, though they sometimes puzzled at the strange smell of the bottles on their parents' nightstands. Servants noticed, of course. They always noticed. But even they sometimes mistook the bottles for ordinary medicine. After all, the labels promised relief, not ruin. Dependence disguised itself as dignity. A husband might stagger slightly as he rose from bed, blaming fatigue from late business. A wife might retreat early each evening, excusing herself with a wan smile and a headache. In truth, both were dosing themselves into oblivion, slipping into sleep not through affection or comfort, but through chemicals. Whole marriages drifted apart under the haze of addiction, neither partner admitting the truth, even as they reached for the same bottle. Now imagine yourself in that world. You've had a day of stiff smiles, tedious visits, and the kind of polite restraint that leaves your bones aching. At last, you're in your room, alone, the curtains drawn tight. You unstopper the bottle, raise it to your lips, and feel the day dissolve. No arguments, no disappointments, no longing unfulfilled. Just a warm tide pulling you away. You tell yourself it's medicine, because that's what the doctor called it. But deep down, you know you no longer sleep without it. There's something almost tragic about it. These were people desperate for relief, from pain, from sorrow, from the exhaustion of always performing. And the world offered them bottles that looked respectable, potions dressed up as remedies. Addiction wasn't just tolerated. It was sold in every chemist's shop with a flourish of scientific authority. Doctors prescribed it. Advertisements praised it. Society looked the other way because to admit the truth would be to admit that respectability was rotting from the inside out. Even the diaries of the time hint at it in careful words. Entries about my usual dose or the cordial that lets me rest. Few admitted outright dependence, but the patterns are clear. The midnight drink wasn't occasional. It was nightly. And those entries usually end the same way. I slept well. A simple phrase covering a complicated truth. Not everyone hid it successfully, of course. There were the masters who slurred their words at breakfast, the mistresses whose hands trembled as they buttered bread, the children who whispered about the strange glass bottles in Mama's room. Servants gossiped, neighbors speculated, and eventually the whispers grew. Addiction was respectable medicine until it wasn't, and then it was a scandal. But until that point, the bottles kept being opened night after night. A few drops in a glass, a spoonful in the dark, a powder slipped quietly onto the tongue. Couples who might once have turned to each other now turned to their remedies instead. The bed no longer a place of intimacy, but a battlefield of separate bottles and silent sips. The respectable home, preserved on the surface, eroded quietly at its core. This was the secret most Victorians never confessed. They lived surrounded by rules, suffocated by appearances, and addicted to escape. Bedrooms became apothecaries of forgetfulness, stocked with the very substances they would condemn in others. Addiction didn't wear rags and sit in alleys. It wore lace nightgowns and velvet slippers, and it curled up quietly behind locked doors. And in the morning, as always, the bed was made, the bottles put away, the masks restored. Respectability carried on, as if the night had been nothing more than peaceful rest. But if you looked closely at the glass bottles glinting on the nightstand, at the hollow eyes behind the polite smiles, you'd see the truth. The Victorian bedroom wasn't only a place of secrets and betrayals. It was also a place where medicine became poison and where silence itself became an addiction. Victorians loved to talk about respectability. They built entire lives around it. Sermons, etiquette manuals, endless rules about gloves, fans, calling cards, and curtains. But behind the locked door of a bedroom, there were desires no etiquette guide could tame. Desires that slipped past lace collars and prayer books. Desires that society insisted did not exist. Yet they did. The proof lingered in whispered stories, in coded diaries, and in the double lives so many Victorians were forced to lead. Same-sex love, for instance, had no official place in respectable society. Men were expected to marry women, produce heirs, and keep the performance rolling. Women were expected to marry men, endure silence, and call it duty. Anything outside that structure was labeled unspeakable, and so it was not spoken, not in Parliament, not in newspapers, not in polite drawing rooms. But the bedroom knew. Letters survive, written in careful hand, folded into envelopes that never made it to the family archive. Diaries survive, locked, coded, and hidden under pillows, so that even a curious maid would be baffled by the strange symbols. These were the secret records of passions Victorians could not admit, but could not silence. A line written in cipher might look like nonsense to an outsider, but to the writer, it was the closest they could come to truth. For women, romantic friendships often carried them through the suffocating confines of marriage. Two women exchanging letters filled with longing, sitting close on sofas, or slipping into one another's rooms at night. Officially, it was harmless companionship. Unofficially, it was love, hidden in plain sight. The language was flowery enough to pass as innocent, but for the women themselves, every word burned with meaning. For men, the stakes were even higher. The law made no distinction between affection and intimacy. Both could destroy lives. A visit to the wrong bedroom, a letter intercepted, a rumor whispered, and everything could collapse. Reputation, career, freedom itself. So men learned to live double lives. By day, dutiful husbands. By night, in bedrooms locked against the world, something else entirely. Now imagine yourself in that time. You've carried the weight of silence all day, smiling politely, speaking carefully. At last, the door shuts. You sit at a desk, pen in hand, and write in a code only you understand. The candle flickers, your heart races, and you pour onto the page a confession you could never say aloud. When you're finished, you slip the diary beneath your pillow. You know it isn't safe. Nothing ever is. But for a moment you feel lighter. Or picture another scene. Two friends officially. Companions, they say. But one knocks gently at the other's bedroom door in the quiet of night. A candle is lit, laughter hushed, and for a few stolen hours, the world is held at bay. No one will ever speak of it. The house itself seems to conspire in silence. The heavy curtains, the muffling carpets, the door that closes just firmly enough to hide what lies within. Society pretended not to see. As long as nothing was admitted, as long as appearances were preserved, silence kept everyone respectable. A husband might suspect, a wife might know, but to acknowledge it aloud would mean scandal. Better to look away, better to maintain the illusion. Respectability was not built on virtue. It was built on silence. Of course, silence had its cracks. Servants noticed, as they always did. Neighbors gossiped when visits stretched suspiciously long. A misplaced letter? A diary discovered? A door left ajar at the wrong moment? All could unleash ruin. Scandals erupted not from the desires themselves, but from the failure to hide them properly. The world judged not passion, but exposure. And so the double lives continued. One face for the world, dutiful, proper, controlled. Another face for the bedroom, longing, reckless, true. It was exhausting, this endless performance. Every day, a tightrope walk over a pit of whispers. Every night, a brief release, stolen and fragile. Imagine the toll it took. You rise in the morning, face set, corset tight, hair pinned. You nod at your spouse, exchange polite words, and go about the rituals of the day. Yet the memory of last night's whispered laughter still lingers, bittersweet. You know it cannot last. You know it cannot be spoken. But for now, it is yours, and the bedroom keeps your secret. The tragedy is how much history lost. Most of these stories burned in fireplaces, destroyed before anyone could find them. What we know comes only from the fragments that survived. The diary a relative forgot to destroy, the letter that slipped into the wrong hands, the whispered account that made its way into a scandal sheet. These scraps remind us that behind every proper portrait of husband and wife, behind every polished family Bible, there may have been another story, lived in shadows. Victorians like to believe they had mastered human behavior, as if etiquette could cage desire. But the truth is, desire slipped past every curtain and every lock. It lived in bedrooms, hidden but persistent, as stubborn as the coal dust that no amount of scrubbing could erase. So when you look at those stiff photographs of couples standing side by side, remember, the real story might not be between the two figures staring grimly at the camera. It might be waiting in the pages of a coded diary under a pillow, or in the memory of a midnight knock on a forbidden door. Respectability was the mask. The bedroom was the truth. And the truth was far more complicated, passionate, and dangerous than polite society ever dared admit. If you don't subscribe, those truths slip back into silence, erased all over again, just as the Victorians wanted. If you don't subscribe, those truths slip back into silence, erased all over again, just as the Victorians wanted. Respectability was supposed to mean order. A tidy home, obedient children, a polished spouse. But behind too many Victorian bedroom doors, respectability was nothing more than a cover, a curtain drawn over bruises, a lock turned against screams. The bedroom wasn't just a stage for whispered arguments or midnight secrets. For many women, it was a prison. Neighbors never saw it. Guests never suspected it. The parlor remained calm, the dining table civilized, the curtains neatly drawn. But inside the bedroom, violence could thrive with impunity. A slammed fist, a thrown object, a body shoved against a wall, all of it muffled by heavy drapery and thick walls. By morning, the house resumed its performance, as if nothing had happened. Courts rarely intervened. The home was considered private, and what happened between husband and wife was beyond the reach of law. A man was permitted in practice, if not in statute, to discipline his wife. Respectable society muttered about keeping order in the home, as if bruises could be justified by Bible verses or property rights. If a woman dared to speak out, the shame often fell on her, not on the man who caused her injuries. Imagine the silence of it. You are seated on the edge of the bed, lace collar pulled high to cover marks on your neck. Tomorrow, you will attend church. Nod politely to neighbors. Smile faintly as if you are simply tired. No one will ask why your eyes look hollow, and if they do, you will answer with the usual word, headache. That single word became a shield for everything unspeakable. The irony, of course, was that respectability itself made violence easier to conceal. Lace gloves covered bruised wrists. High-necked gowns hid discolored skin. A wife could sit through a dinner party in perfect composure, her injuries tucked away beneath silk and taffeta. Guests would remark on her elegance, her calm demeanor, her polite smile, never guessing what the bedroom had demanded of her the night before. Children sometimes saw more than anyone realized. Woken by noise, they peeked through doorways or heard muffled sobs through walls. Some carried those memories quietly for years, learning early that silence was safer than truth. Servants noticed too. They always did. They laundered bloodied linens, tended fires that burned through long, restless nights, fetched brandy for trembling hands. But servants knew the cost of speaking. Their silence was bought not with loyalty, but with survival. Now put yourself in that world. You're standing in a bedroom that should feel safe, yet every creak of the floorboards, every shadow near the door, fills you with dread. You move carefully. You speak softly. You keep the peace however you can. When the moment comes, you endure it in silence. And afterward, you smooth the sheets, tidy the room, and prepare yourself to play the role of respectability once more. The diaries that survive often speak in code. Women wrote of dark nights, of troubles, of discipline, without naming what really happened. To write it plainly was dangerous. A husband could discover the diary, a maid could stumble upon it, and suddenly the act of recording became another crime. Respectability demanded not only endurance, but erasure. And yet, in court records, the truth sometimes slipped through. A divorce petition, rare and scandalous, would detail cruelty in terms so restrained they barely concealed the horror. A witness statement might mention screams, bruises, or unexplained injuries. But these were exceptions. For most women, the violence remained locked inside the bedroom, unrecorded, unnamed. It's tempting to imagine Victorian society as blissfully unaware. In reality, they knew, and they chose to ignore it. To admit the violence was to admit that respectability was a sham. It was easier to look at a woman in lace and pearls and decide she was simply pale, simply delicate, simply tired, anything but battered. The cost of that silence was devastating. Bedrooms that should have been sanctuaries were instead cages. The very room that represented intimacy became a place of fear. The bed, so proudly displayed in furniture catalogs and household guides, became the site of punishment, of forced submission, of nights that blurred into dread. Imagine rising the next morning, pulling on gloves that hide your injuries, fastening a brooch at your throat to cover the marks. You descend to breakfast, pour tea with a steady hand, and nod at your husband across the table. To the outside world, you are the perfect couple. Inside, you are barely holding yourself together. The silence was the real violence. It wasn't just the act itself. It was the enforced pretending afterward, the smiles, the polite chatter, the endless denial. A bruised cheek could heal, a broken rib could knit, but the silence hollowed you out, night after night, until you became a shadow in your own home. And when history remembers the Victorians, it prefers to look at their stiff portraits, their orderly parlors, their respectable exteriors. But those portraits don't show the truth. The truth lived behind closed doors, where lace hid bruises and silence hid screams. Respectability may have fooled society, but the bedrooms never lied. By day, the Victorian bedroom looked proper, polished, and heavy with drapery. But at certain moments in a woman's life, it transformed into something far more dramatic, a birthing room. And the irony? The event that kept society alive, the act of bringing new Victorians into the world, was almost never spoken of in polite company. Babies were celebrated, christenings announced, portraits commissioned. But what happened in that bedroom, behind locked doors and muffled curtains, was treated as a secret too indecent to discuss. Childbirth was not a hospital matter. For most women, it happened right where they slept. The bed became the battlefield. Sheets were stripped, water boiled, cloths prepared, and midwives called. The air filled with the smell of sweat, blood, and coal smoke, a mix never mentioned in household manuals. Curtains were drawn to darken the room, creating a cave-like space where the outside world did not intrude. And if you were a man, well, you were not invited. Respectable husbands were expected to remain outside, pacing anxiously or pretending to stay calm with a glass of brandy in the drawing room. Childbirth was considered women's business, and the screams of your wife were simply another sound you were expected to ignore. Imagine that, the most important moment of your family's life unfolding a few feet away, and your role was to stay silent, out of sight, as though you had nothing to do with it. Inside the bedroom, however, nothing was silent. Women labored for hours, sometimes days, their cries muffled only by heavy curtains and thick walls. Midwives worked tirelessly, some skilled, some less so, often relying on practices passed down orally rather than scientifically tested. In wealthier homes, a doctor might be called, but doctors were just as likely to make matters worse with unwashed hands or experimental tools. Either way, the suffering was immense. And yet, when the ordeal ended, society demanded that it be erased. The mother must emerge composed, the baby christened, and no one must ever mention what really happened between those four walls. The ritual of lying in shows just how far the silence went. After giving birth, a woman was expected to remain confined to her bedroom for weeks, even months. Curtains drawn, visitors kept away, the room became a chamber of convalescence and isolation. Officially, lying in was for recovery. Unofficially, it was also a way of keeping the mess of childbirth hidden from the eyes of respectable society. A woman could vanish upstairs for 2 months, and when she reappeared, slimmed down and polished, it was as if the ordeal had never happened. But sometimes, the ordeal didn't end at all. Maternal mortality was one of the darkest truths of Victorian bedrooms. Every birth was a gamble, a hemorrhage, an infection, a prolonged labor. All could prove fatal. Doctors didn't always understand germ theory, and hygiene was often neglected. The same hands that delivered a baby might also have just performed an autopsy or attended another patient without washing. Women knew this, and many entered labor with the quiet knowledge that it could be their last night alive. Imagine yourself in that room. The curtains are closed, the fire is low, and you are surrounded by midwives and attendants. Your body is racked with pain. Hours feel like years, and each cry you stifle only adds to the weight of silence. You look at the faces around you, some sympathetic, some worried, and you wonder if you will live long enough to see the dawn. Outside, your husband waits, smoking a cigar and trying not to hear. Upstairs in the bedroom, history is happening in blood and sweat, but it will never be recorded. When things went well, the bedroom became a nursery almost instantly. The child was washed, wrapped, and placed in a cradle by the bed. Visitors flooded the house, congratulating the family, commenting on the baby's features, debating who it resembled most. The mother, pale and exhausted, was propped up with pillows, forced to smile for guests when she could barely breathe. Respectability demanded appearances, even in moments of near death. When things went badly, the house fell silent. Curtains were drawn tighter, bells muffled, whispers replaced laughter. A woman might die in that very bed, leaving behind a newborn who might not survive either. Servants quietly carried out blood-soaked linens, while neighbors whispered in the street about complications. Rarely did anyone say the word death. It was softened, blurred, erased. Respectable society preferred not to acknowledge that the bedroom, so carefully curated as a stage for virtue, was also a chamber of mortality. And then there were the children who didn't survive. Infants died frequently, sometimes within hours, sometimes days. Their absence was rarely spoken of outside the home. Portraits might show a family with fewer children than were actually born, the erased lives unmentioned. But in the bedroom, the loss was carved deep. Women kept locks of hair, tiny shoes, or baptismal gowns never used. These tokens were hidden away in drawers, memorials folded into silence. Of course, not every childbirth story ended in tragedy. Many ended in relief, in laughter through tears, in the exhaustion of survival. Yet even then, the truth of it remained hidden. The parlor displayed the christening gown, but never the labor. The newspapers announced the heir, but never the agony. Respectability demanded that birth, the very foundation of society, remain invisible. It's tempting to laugh at the absurdity. An entire culture that refused to admit the existence of pain, sweat, and blood, while relying entirely on it to keep their world turning. They would discuss politics, railways, empire, and reform, but not the very process by which the next generation was born. Instead, that truth stayed in the bedroom, unspoken, invisible, but unforgettable for the women who endured it. Imagine, once more, being her. You have survived the night. You cradle your child, tears on your cheeks, body broken but spirit holding. Tomorrow, you will be expected to smile as if nothing happened. Respectability requires it. But you will remember. The walls of your bedroom will remember. And though history may not record it, the truth of your life and your suffering lives here, in the space society tried hardest to ignore. The Victorian bedroom was not just a stage for intimacy or betrayal. It was also the place where life began and too often ended. The cradle and the coffin were not so far apart, and between them, silence stretched. A silence demanded by respectability, but one that left scars on every family it touched. Victorian men liked to lecture about morality. They wrote pamphlets about virtue, stood in pulpits railing against sin, and passed laws designed to keep society clean. And then, when the sermons ended and the doors closed, many of them marched straight into the streets to purchase exactly what they condemned. Brothels thrived in Victorian Britain. In fact, they were as common as pubs in some districts. In London alone, thousands of women worked the streets or in houses lit with discreet lamps. Respectable gentlemen, politicians, businessmen, even clergymen, slipped through those doors at night, and in the morning they slipped back into their own respectable bedrooms, carrying with them traces of their double lives. Imagine it. A husband returns late, the smell of brandy heavy on his breath, but beneath it something else lingers. Perfume. Not the familiar rose water his wife used, but something sharper, headier, foreign. His coat carries a smear of powder, his collar a faint lipstick stain. He moves carefully, boots in hand, trying not to wake her. But she notices. Of course she notices. The women of the house always did. Wives, however, were trapped. To confront him would be to admit publicly that something was wrong. And in Victorian society, a wife's role was to preserve appearances. Better to say nothing, to smile at breakfast, to pour the tea with steady hands while her husband avoids her eyes. The silence wasn't ignorance. It was survival. Servants, on the other hand, didn't need to guess. They saw the boots returning at dawn. They laundered the stained shirts. They caught the unfamiliar perfume in the air. Whispers spread through kitchens and sculleries. The master was late again. That's not the mistress's scent. By the time the gossip cooled, the whole household knew what the wife was expected never to mention, and society? Society looked away. Respectability meant pretending that what everyone knew simply didn't exist. Brothels were whispered about, not named. Diseases spread quietly, but rarely discussed. Doctors treated symptoms without judgment, while wives bore the consequences in silence. Respectability required a kind of national denial, as if the scent of perfume could evaporate if ignored long enough. But the truth seeped in anyway. Diaries of the period are filled with women hinting at betrayal. Some wrote of husbands who avoided their beds altogether. Others noted the faint smells, the late hours, the carelessness that revealed everything without a word being spoken. These women knew. They always knew. But respectability bound their tongues. Now imagine yourself as one of them. You sit in your bedroom, hair unpinned, candle guttering low. The door opens, and your husband enters. He smiles faintly, mutters a greeting, and begins to undress. You watch him remove his coat and place it carefully on the chair. The faint trace of perfume drifts across the room. Not yours. Never yours. You feel the weight of it pressing on your chest, but you say nothing. You smile. You lie down. Respectability requires the silence. Or perhaps you're the husband. You've spent the evening in smoke-filled rooms, in laughter too loud to be respectable, in the arms of someone whose name you didn't ask. You walk home through fog and gaslight, collar turned up, guilt gnawing but never enough to stop you. You slip into your bedroom. hoping she will believe the lie, hoping the servants will keep their mouths shut. You know they know. You know she knows. But in this strange Victorian bargain, as long as no one says the words aloud, the illusion survives. The greatest irony is how public this private sin actually was. Brothels weren't hidden in shadowy corners. They flourished in city centers. Some were discreet houses, others grand establishments with velvet curtains and chandeliers. The men who visited them returned to Parliament the next day, to business meetings, to family dinners, as if nothing had happened. Respectability didn't erase the reality. It just insisted no one speak of it. And then there was disease. Venereal infections spread quickly, carried from brothel to bedroom. Wives contracted illnesses they never deserved, their health quietly sacrificed on the altar of their husbands' double lives. To speak of it was unthinkable. To complain was unrespectable. So the sickness was endured in silence, hidden beneath lace collars and polite smiles. Servants whispered, wives suffered, and society pretended. It was a triangle of silence, holding together the fragile facade of respectability, a facade built not on virtue, but on denial. Imagine once more, you're standing at the window of your bedroom, watching the fog roll in. Somewhere beyond it, men are laughing too loudly. Women are waiting in lamplit doorways. You know your husband is among them. You know he will return, smelling faintly of brandy and perfume. Tomorrow, you will both smile across the breakfast table. The servants will keep your tea hot, and no one will mention the silence pressing on every wall of your bedroom. This was Victorian respectability in its purest form. Everyone knew, no one spoke. Husbands carried their betrayals home. Wives bore the silence, servants carried the gossip, and society closed its eyes. Bedrooms were not sanctuaries of love. They were repositories of secrets, perfumed with deceit, held together by the fragile glue of silence. Respectable? Perhaps by daylight, but by night, the truth came home and lingered in the curtains. Victorians loved to pretend they were paragons of chastity. Polite manuals, sermons, and household guides hammered the message endlessly. Control yourself, restrain yourself, deny yourself. To read the moralists of the age, you'd think every couple spent their married years in separate beds, talking about the weather and nothing more. But bedrooms have a way of cracking even the strongest performance. Behind bolted doors, far from neighbors and polite drawing rooms, repression gave way to experimentation, though no one would ever admit it. The evidence wasn't left in open view. It was sold under counters, passed hand to hand, wrapped in brown paper. Sex manuals, pamphlets, diagrams. All things a respectable Victorian would claim never to have seen. Yet they sold briskly, disguised as marital guides or health manuals. These little books whispered what the parlor dared not say. Some were earnest attempts at instruction, others pure titillation. Either way, they circulated, hidden in drawers and tucked between Bibles, proof that curiosity thrived even in the land of moral panic. Imagine yourself slipping into a London bookshop. You linger politely over the Dickens on display, then lean toward the shopkeeper and murmur your real request. He nods, disappears behind the counter, and returns with a slim volume in brown paper. You slip it under your coat and hurry home, pulse quickening, because you know full well that being caught with it could tarnish your reputation forever. And yet, you buy it anyway. Respectability was for daylight. Curiosity belonged to the bedroom. Once inside, couples experimented quietly. A world that preached restraint left people fumbling in the dark, but fumbling didn't stop them. The manuals offered suggestions, some clumsy, some startlingly inventive. They were read by candlelight, tried in silence, and hidden away before morning. Outwardly, the marriage remained pious. Inwardly, the bedroom saw a different story. For women, the contradictions were crushing. They were told to be modest, passive, and pure, but also to satisfy their husbands, produce heirs, and keep the household harmonious. How? Manuals promised to reveal the secret, though their advice often veered into the absurd. Some recommended ice baths to cool passions. Others insisted wives must endure intimacy without complaint, while a select few hinted at pleasures no sermon would ever allow. The result was confusion, silence, and experimentation kept under lock and key. For men, the pressure was different. Masculinity was tied to vigor, and vigor to performance. Manuals promised to strengthen men, offering powders, belts, even electrical devices meant to ensure virility. The fear of failure was as real as the fear of scandal. And so, behind closed doors, some tried anything, from quack contraptions to whispered instructions smuggled in pamphlets, all in service of a respectability that demanded results but refused to discuss how those results might be achieved. Now imagine yourself in one of those bedrooms. The door bolted, the curtains drawn, the manuals tucked under a pillow. You and your spouse sit awkwardly on the edge of the bed, the candle flickering, the silence loud. You laugh nervously at the absurdity of the instructions. But then, curiosity wins. You try. You experiment. And for a few moments, the heavy weight of Victorian morality lifts. You are not a statue, not a sermon, not a portrait. Just a person. A very human person. The servants, of course, noticed hints of this world, though no one admitted it aloud. They saw the manuals slipped into laundry, the strange contraptions left half hidden in drawers, the whispers of laughter or muffled sounds behind bolted doors. Servants didn't always understand what they saw, or pretended not to. But they carried the gossip with them. The unspoken world upstairs was fodder for stories downstairs. But the most revealing evidence comes not from servants or gossip, but from the Victorians themselves. Diaries, court records, even medical journals occasionally betray just how much experimentation happened behind closed doors. A coded entry here, a confession there, an anonymous case described by a doctor. Together they form a mosaic of quiet rebellion. The bedroom, far from being a shrine to chastity, was often the only place where repression cracked. Society, of course, pretended not to see. Respectability was built on silence, and silence was easier than truth. Couples who experimented never spoke of it outside the bedroom. Friends never confessed to one another, not even in whispers. To acknowledge desire was to risk scandal. And so the double life continued, piety in public, experimentation in private. The irony is that the more Victorians denied their sexuality, the more it flourished underground. Every bolt on a bedroom door, every manual hidden under a mattress, every secret experiment proved that repression didn't erase desire. It only forced it into silence. Imagine waking the next morning. The manual is back under the pillow, the drawer locked, the evidence tidied away. You descend to breakfast with a polite smile, discuss the weather, perhaps mention the Queen's latest speech. Nothing betrays what happened the night before. Respectability remains intact. The bedroom keeps your secret. And so history remembers Victorians as stiff, humorless, buttoned up. But behind those bolted doors, The truth was more complicated. They were curious, they were inventive, they were human. They lived double lives, one in the parlor, proper and restrained, the other in the bedroom, unspoken, but undeniable. The portraits on the wall won't tell you this, neither will the etiquette manuals, but the diaries, the letters, the coded notes under pillows, and the manuals in brown paper reveal it clearly enough. Repression was never absolute. The cracks in the facade widened every night. Respectability was the mask. The bedroom was the stage where the mask slipped. And the play that unfolded there, awkward, secret, passionate, never admitted, was far more revealing than anything society allowed itself to say aloud. If you don't subscribe, those plays vanish back under the mattress, hidden again exactly as the Victorians intended. From the outside, Victorian marriage looked like a triumph of order. The couple seated side by side at dinner, the family portraits hanging above the mantel, the polished silver engraved with two proud initials entwined. To neighbors and visitors, it all looked seamless, a man and woman united, respectable, unshakable. But behind the door of the bedroom, where the coal fire flickered and the curtains hung heavy with soot, the story was very different. For many, marriage wasn't a matter of romance at all. It was a contract, a carefully arranged exchange of names, property, and expectations. Love was optional. Heirs were not. The bed, for all its carved mahogany grandeur, was less a place of companionship than a production line, the one space in which duty was expected to yield results. Imagine lying there. The mattress is lumpy, the sheets heavy, and beside you lies your spouse, not a lover, not even necessarily a friend, but a partner in the cold arithmetic of family continuity. You exchange polite words before turning to face opposite walls. The silence that follows is not hostile. It's simply empty. Two people sharing the same bed, but living entirely different lives. For women, the longing was often for companionship, a hand held, a conversation that stretched beyond the logistics of meals or children, the kind of intimacy not found in manuals or sermons. But those longings rarely cross the heavy silence of the bedroom. To admit them was to risk seeming ungrateful, demanding, or worse, unfeminine. So women smiled, folded their hands neatly on the coverlet, and pretended that duty was enough. For men, the longing was often for freedom. Freedom from obligation, from polite performance, from the endless ritual of household appearances. The bed beside their wives could feel like a cage, and so many slipped away. To clubs, to friends, to taverns, to anywhere the silence did not press so heavily. And when they returned, late into the night, they carried the smell of freedom with them. Tobacco, brandy, perfume. The irony was that respectability insisted these couples were paragons of virtue. The portraits show them stiff and dignified, framed in gilt. The household ledgers list them as prosperous and respectable. But the reality in the bedroom was a profound loneliness. Side by side in the same bed, their hearts beat on different rhythms. Their minds wandered in different directions. Their lives ran in parallel, but rarely touched. Servants, of course, noticed. They turned down the sheets, stoked the fires, collected the untouched chamber pots. They saw the subtle signs. Beds unslept in, covers folded just so. Two people who occupied the same space but never the same night. Downstairs, in whispers over the scullery table, they joked that the couple lived like strangers who happened to share a roof. Respectability was a mask, and the servants always glimpsed the cracks. Now imagine yourself in that bed, The fire is dying, the room is cold, and you can hear the steady breathing of the person beside you. You want to speak, to break the silence, but the words stick. What would you even say? That you are lonely? That you wish for more? Respectability has trained you to endure in silence, to treat longing as weakness. So you lie still, eyes fixed on the dark ceiling, wondering if this is all marriage is meant to be. Sometimes the loneliness grew unbearable, and so people sought connection elsewhere. Letters written in secret, affairs conducted in whispers, friendships clung to with desperate intensity. But in the bedroom, none of that mattered. There, the contract loomed larger than any emotion. The bed was both symbol and sentence, a nightly reminder of the gulf between two lives bound together by law but not by love. It's tempting to picture all Victorians as perpetually passionless. That's not quite true. Many felt deeply, desired deeply, longed deeply. But the culture left them with no language to express it. They hid it instead. In diaries, in novels read by candlelight, in quiet sighs after the lamps were blown out. And so the great irony of Victorian marriage was that the bed, meant to symbolize unity, often embodied isolation. Wives clutched pillows as substitutes for affection. Husbands stared into the darkness, rehearsing excuses for why they'd return late tomorrow. Nights blurred together. Silence stretched on, and in the morning, both rose to play their parts again, smiling at breakfast, exchanging polite words, maintaining the facade. Respectability demanded the mask remain firmly in place, no matter how lonely it felt beneath. Some diaries speak of women longing not for passion, but simply for presence. A husband who might actually listen. A companion who might laugh with them. Others hint at the bitterness of men who felt trapped in marriages arranged for wealth or position, staring night after night at someone they barely knew. These voices rarely made it to the official record, but they echo in the fragments that survived. The bed itself became symbolic. Polished wood, carved posts, embroidered linens, all meant to show prosperity. But beneath the covers, the silence spoke louder than any decoration. Two bodies lying inches apart, yet worlds away. Same bed, different lives. And still, respectability endured. To admit unhappiness was unthinkable. Divorce was rare, scandalous, often ruinous. So couples endured year after year, night after night, performing the same ritual of silence. They smiled at neighbors, christened children, hosted dinners. And in the privacy of their bedroom, they lay beside one another, lonely in company, bound by duty but separated by silence. Imagine one last time. The candles are extinguished. The coal fire has burned down to ash. The room is quiet, save for the faint ticking of the mantel clock. You lie on one side of the bed, your spouse on the other. You could reach out, close the distance with a touch, a word, a sigh. But you don't. You both remain still, locked in parallel lives, the gulf between you as wide as any ocean. By morning, you will rise, dress, and play your roles again. To the world, you are the perfect couple. To yourselves, you are simply two lonely people sharing a bed. Respectability demanded the illusion of unity. The bedroom revealed the truth. Unity was often a performance, and loneliness was the reality it concealed. Respectability was supposed to be unshakable. The portraits, the manners, the heavy curtains, all designed to say, this household is secure, proper, and beyond reproach. But behind bedroom doors, that security was fragile. Too fragile. Because secrets don't just sit quietly, they have witnesses. And in Victorian homes, Those witnesses were often inside the walls, servants, children, even relatives. And sometimes, silence had a price. Bedrooms weren't just places of sleep or secrecy. They were treasuries of evidence. Letters tucked under pillows, diaries hidden in drawers, whispered conversations overheard through thin plaster walls. And in an age obsessed with reputation, even the faintest scrap of evidence could be transformed into a weapon. Servants, of course, were the most dangerous witnesses. They moved silently through the house, tending fires, collecting laundry, dusting shelves. They saw which beds were slept in and which weren't. They noticed when unfamiliar perfume clung to a master's collar. They found crumpled notes in wastebaskets, half-burned letters in fireplaces, discarded keepsakes under mattresses. And while most servants stayed discreet, out of duty or necessity, some realized just how valuable their knowledge was. Imagine yourself as one of them. You're a maid, turning down a bed for the night, when you notice a folded letter tucked between the pillows. You glance at it, meaning to ignore it, but a few words catch your eye. Last night was bliss. Tonight again? Your stomach knots. You know instantly that this isn't for the mistress. Now you have a choice. Pretend you never saw it, or keep the knowledge in your pocket, a quiet card to play if your own position in the house is ever threatened. Others didn't wait for threats. They created them. There are cases where servants confronted their employers, hinting at what they knew. A valet who implied he could mention the master's nightly absences to the wrong ears. A governess who stumbled on a love letter and suddenly found herself with unexpected leverage. Blackmail didn't always involve outright demands for money. Sometimes it was more subtle: better wages, kinder treatment, a dismissal quietly withdrawn in exchange for silence. And it wasn't only servants. Family members could be just as dangerous. A younger sibling who overheard a midnight quarrel. A cousin staying as a guest who accidentally saw too much. Even children, sharp-eyed and quick to repeat things they didn't understand, could hold the power to topple reputations. A child who asked, "Why was Uncle in Mama's room?" could create a scandal that rippled through a household for years. The threat was always the same: exposure. Respectability was a house of cards, and one whispered secret could bring it crashing down. The mere possibility of scandal was enough to terrify most families into submission. A husband might tolerate a servant he despised simply because that servant knew where he spent his nights. A wife might endure a bullying relative because that relative had once glimpsed her with someone else. The bedroom, meant to be private, was constantly at risk of being weaponized. Now imagine yourself on the receiving end. You're seated in your bedroom, hands shaking as you reread the letter you thought you had burned. But no, someone retrieved it, and now it lies on the desk before you, returned with a knowing look. The message is clear. They know. Your reputation hangs in their hands. What do? Deny it? Beg? Pay? The walls of your bedroom seem to close in tighter, not with comfort, but with menace. Diaries were especially dangerous. Many Victorians poured their hearts into them. Grief, longing, illicit details never spoken aloud. But diaries are only safe if no one reads them. A servant dusting the desk, a child snooping, a jealous spouse searching drawers. All it took was one curious pair of eyes. Whole lives could unravel because of words meant for no audience. In a culture where silence was survival, the act of writing was a gamble. And then there was the calculated blackmail of society itself. Newspapers thrived on scandal. Journalists paid well for inside stories, and a servant dismissed without reference could turn to the press with tales of midnight visits and forbidden letters. Respectability wasn't destroyed in Parliament or courtrooms most of the time. It was destroyed in headlines, whispered from one household to the next, fueled by the words of those who had seen too much. Picture yourself as a Victorian lady, seated rigidly on the edge of your bed, while a former maid threatens to reveal your private correspondence unless you provide a gift to help her along her way. Or picture yourself as a gentleman holding a crumpled note in your fist, knowing that your valet, the man who polishes your boots, has read it and might one day decide to use it against you. Every relationship in the household became a balance of fear and dependence. And because scandal was such a powerful weapon, even false whispers could ruin. A letter didn't need to exist. The mere suggestion that it might was enough to poison a reputation. The fear of exposure gave blackmailers all the leverage they needed. It was not truth that destroyed respectability. It was the threat of truth. So the Victorian bedroom was never entirely private. Its walls kept out neighbors, but not servants. Its locks kept out visitors, but not suspicion. Every secret lived under constant risk of discovery, and every discovery could be turned into profit. Respectability looked solid in the portraits on the wall, but in reality, it was brittle. One overheard whisper, one hidden diary, one servant's revenge away from collapse. Now imagine lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the tick of the mantel clock. You know someone in the house holds your secret. You don't know when they might use it. Tonight? Tomorrow? Never. That's the worst part. The silence is heavy, not because it hides your secret, but because it could break at any moment. Respectability wasn't just fragile, it was for sale. And the price was set not by those who lived in the grand bedrooms, but by those who worked in their shadows. For all its curtains, carpets, and careful performances, the Victorian bedroom always carried one inescapable truth. It was often the place where life ended. Hospitals were places of last resort, reserved for the poor or the desperate. Respectable people, when their time came, died at home. And more often than not, they died in their beds. The same bed that hosted whispered quarrels, midnight confessions, or secret letters would eventually hold lingering illness and final breaths. Victorians lived with that awareness constantly. Every piece of ornate furniture, every embroidered quilt carried not only the promise of sleep but the shadow of mortality. Imagine yourself lying in such a bed, the fire low, curtains drawn against the London fog. The house is hushed, the air heavy with the smell of medicine and candle wax. Family members file in quietly, servants hover at the edges, and the physician murmurs instructions in tones that suggest he has little hope. You are no longer simply the master or mistress of the house. You are the center of a ritual everyone knew too well. Deathbed rituals were a Victorian specialty. Families gathered at the bedside to hear last words, often written down or repeated afterward as though they were sacred scripture. Children were brought in, even the very young, so they could remember the solemn moment. Relatives recorded who said what, who wept, who held whose hand. Respectability demanded a dignified passing, as if even death was a performance to be carried out with composure. And when the moment came, it was not unusual for relics to be taken. A lock of hair, snipped carefully and tied with ribbon. A handkerchief that had touched the lips of the dying. Sometimes even the bed itself became a relic, preserved as a shrine long after. Families clung to these objects, folding their grief into tangible keepsakes. To modernize, it might seem morbid. To Victorians, it was memory made physical. Now imagine yourself again, but this time as the one left behind. You sit on the edge of a bed still warm from the body that occupied it. The sheets are carefully folded, the pillow indented. You reach for a keepsake, perhaps a lock of hair, perhaps the rosary still clutched in the hand. Around you, the room feels frozen, every detail charged with memory. The bed is no longer just furniture. It has become a shrine. Photography, too, entered the ritual. Post-mortem portraits were common, sometimes taken in bedrooms with the deceased propped gently against pillows, eyes closed, hands folded. Families stood nearby, dressed in mourning, faces rigid with grief. To us, these images can feel eerie. To Victorians, they were cherished mementos, proof that respectability endured even at life's end. The bedroom, once private, became briefly public as photographers captured its final occupant. Illness lingered there as well. Bedrooms were not just sites of sudden death, but of slow decline. Tuberculosis, fevers, cancers. They stretched on for months, even years, with the sick confined to their beds. Servants nursed them, family members kept vigil, doctors came and went with bottles of tonics and whispered prognoses. The entire household adjusted around the sickbed, and the room became both prison and sanctuary. The smell was unforgettable, medicines sharp and bitter, sheets changed too often or not often enough, air thick with coal smoke and disinfectants. Yet through it all, families clung to the performance of respectability. Visitors were received at the bedside. Prayers were recited. Curtains were adjusted so the dying might be bathed in a dignified half-light. Servants carried much of the burden. They lifted, cleaned, fetched, and sat silently through long nights when others slept. They knew when the end was near before the doctor admitted it, because they had seen it too many times before. And when the death finally came, it was often a servant who closed the eyes, straightened the limbs, and prepared the body before the family gathered. For Victorians, death in the bedroom was not a disruption. It was expected. Children grew up with it, spouses anticipated it, servants endured it. And in a culture obsessed with appearances, the bedroom death was the ultimate test of respectability. To die well, calmly, with dignity, in the presence of family, was the final performance. Yet behind that performance was sorrow too deep for words. Families kept beds untouched for months, even years, unwilling to disturb the space where their loved one had taken their last breath. Curtains remained closed, objects preserved, silence heavy. The bedroom became a mausoleum within the house, memory layered into every fold of fabric. Now imagine the weight of it. You enter your own bedroom after losing someone you love, and everything looks the same. The bedstead carved with initials, the quilt embroidered years ago, the same wallpaper. And yet, it all feels changed. The air is heavy, the silence unbearable. You sit on the edge of the bed and feel as though the walls themselves are grieving with you. And so every Victorian bed carried the weight of mortality. It was the site of birth, of love, however awkward or contractual, of betrayal, of illness, and finally of death. To climb into bed at night was not only to prepare for sleep, but to lie in the very place where you or your loved ones would one day take your last breath. That knowledge lingered under every quilt and pillow. Respectability tried to soften it with rituals, relics, and photographs. But the truth could not be erased. The Victorian bedroom was as much a place of endings as beginnings. And behind every lace curtain, behind every carefully arranged quilt, the shadow of death was always waiting. So here we are, at the end of the tour. You've crept through parlors and corridors, peeked into nurseries and sculleries, but it was the bedroom that gave the Victorians away. The parlor was all for show, lace curtains, perfect posture, polite chatter. The dining room was performance too, all silver and small talk. But the bedroom? The bedroom was the place where masks slipped. Everything they denied in public lived here. Passion, however awkwardly hidden in brown paper manuals. Violence, muffled under lace and silence. Longing, scribbled into diaries and tucked under pillows. Addiction, measured in spoonfuls of laudanum at midnight. Betrayal, carried home on boots that reeked of perfume not your own. Every contradiction of the age, their sermons on virtue, their obsession with appearances, their desperate hunger for what they weren't supposed to want, played out behind those doors. It wasn't Parliament or the pulpit or the polite drawing room where the Victorians revealed themselves. It was here, in the fire-lit dark, when the servants had gone to bed and the curtains were drawn tight. The bedroom was the stage, and on it, the Victorians performed their truest selves, lonely, flawed, desperate, passionate, addicted, betrayed, grieving. Human, in other words. And maybe that's why their bedrooms still whisper to us today. Because behind all the velvet curtains and carved mahogany beds, the Victorians weren't so different. They pretended harder, perhaps. They buried their truths deeper. But at night, in silence, they lived with the same contradictions we do. The same longings, the same fears, the same fragile humanity. So now, close your eyes. Let the coal fire fade. Let the ticking of the mantel clock lull you into calm. The Victorians are long gone, their secrets scattered in ashes, their beds empty, their masks cracked. But the truth of them lingers in those rooms, heavy, fragile, unspoken. Respectability was a mask. The bedroom was the truth. And every night, that truth unfolded again and again, until the curtains finally closed for good. And if you've stayed awake this long, remember, by subscribing, you're keeping these forgotten voices alive. Without you, they vanish back into silence, just as Victorian respectability wanted. With you, they're remembered, retold, and shared. Which means, in your own quiet way, you've just defied an entire century of silence.